Good morning to you all. In today's class, we shall be discussing endocrinology of reproduction. That means the hormones which regulate the menstrual cycle, reproduction, birth, lactation, and finally, at the end of the reproductive lifespan, menopause. Before we go on to endocrinology or hormones, we have to know a bit about the development of the gonads and the other organs of the reproductive system. Embryologically, the gonads pass through 4 stages of development. Stage 1, stage of indifferent gonad. Stage 2, stage of gonadal differentiation. 3, stage of oocyte development, and stage of follicular development. The gonads can be testes in male and the ovaries in female. Developmentally, the primordial germ cells they develop from the ectoderm and present in the endoderm of the yolk sac at around 3rd week of gestation age. After that, these primordial germ cells they migrate by the action of fibronectin and a c-KIT oncogen which produces a c-KIT protein, and they migrate and reach the gonadal ridge by the 5th to 6th week of gestational age. It is very important that the germ cell reach the gonadal ridge because the gonadal ridge is the only part of the embryological structure in which the primordial germ cells can survive. Now, we'll talk about c-KIT oncogen a bit. The c-KIT oncogen is very important in 2 or 3 pathological conditions. In intersex individuals, there has been seen that there is a delayed c-KIT oncogen transcription and c-KIT oncogen protein production. So there is a delayed migration of the primordial germ cells. So these individuals, they have a higher risk of testicular carcinoma. In females who have the c-KIT oncogen mutations, they have been seen to have premature ovarian failure with a higher incidence. So as I already said, by 5th to 6th week, the primordial germ cell will hit the gonadal ridge. The primordial germ cells push the coelomic epithelium outside to form a covering. The mesenchymal cell forms the supporting tissue, and behind the primordial germ cell there is the mesonephric tissue which later on forms the urinary system. So the urinary system and the gonads they develop from the whole complex structure called the urogenital ridge. So all this form of different gonad. Why is this stage known as indifferent gonad? Because at this stage the gonad does not know whether it is forming the testis or ovary. So when does the gonad receive signal which tells it whether it is going to form testis or ovary? At the end of 6th week. What is the source of the signal then? The presence of Y chromosome. If this is present, then the Y chromosome has a sex determining region or SRY gene which produces the testis determining factor protein which causes the development of the gonad into a testis. In case where this testis determining factor is not produced because of absence of SRY, because of absence of Y chromosome, that means in a female fetus, the testicular development does not occur. In that case, the gonad develops into the ovary. So the signal for formation of ovary is the absence of Y chromosome and SRY. So this is of gonadal differentiation. The SRY gene is not alone. It acts along with other genes like SOX9 gene which have a similar DNA domain which along with proteins like fibroblast growth factor 9 and steroidogenic factor 1, these direct the somatic cells of the gonads to produce Sertoli cells instead of follicles. If Sertoli cells are produced, it will go form a testis. If follicles, it will form a ovary. See, any gonad will have two kind of cells. One is the germ cell, that is spermatogonia and oogonia, and the somatic cells, which are the supporting cells. What is the source of this somatic cell then? The coelomic epithelium, the mesenchyme, and the mesonephric tissue. So all of this is happening around 6 to 7 weeks of gestational age. So if the gonad has to develop into the testis, it will happen between the 6 to 9 gestational weeks. At 7 weeks, as I already told, because of the SRY gene, the somatic cell produces Sertoli cells. These Sertoli cells produce a very important hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone, which is also known as Mullerian inhibiting substance or Mullerian inhibiting factor. The AMH gene is located on chromosome 19p13.3. Now what does this mean? See, any chromosome has two chromatids and each chromatid has a P arm and a Q arm. The regions of the P arm and Q arm have been numbered. So on this 13.3 region of the P arm of 19th chromosome lies the AMH gene. The AMH acts on the AMH2 receptors located on the Sertoli cell. So it is an autocrine action. The function of the anti-Mullerian hormone, as the name suggests, is inhibition or regression of the Mullerian duct. Now look at this embryologic structure. This is the gonad, developing gonad. The purple color structure that you are seeing here is the mesonephric duct, also known as the Wolffian duct, and this pinkish red structure is the paramesonephric duct or the Mullerian duct. AMH inhibits this Mullerian duct. The Wolffian duct, under the influence of testosterone, we'll talk about the source of testosterone later, differentiates into the epididymis, vas deferens, and seminal vesicle in male. The Mullerian duct, in the presence of AMH, regresses and does not form uterus and fallopian tube and vagina in the males, while in females, because the SRY gene is not there, because the Y chromosome is not there, because the Sertoli cells are not produced, and because AMH is not produced, because of absence of AMH, the Mullerian duct does not regress, and so the uterus, fallopian tube, and the upper part of the vagina forms in a female fetus. So by the 7th week, I already told you the Sertoli cells, they will start functioning. The Sertoli cells get arranged in cord-like structures called testicular sex cords. This is a Sertoli cell. This is a Sertoli cell nucleus. They'll form cord-like structures, and in these cord-like structures, these primordial germ cells will get embedded, these yellow color structures. So the first function of the Sertoli cell is to nourish the spermatogonia in the process of spermatogenesis. The second important function is secretory. As I already told, it produces AMH. It produces inhibin and activin, which are secreted. It produces androgen binding protein, which helps in maintaining the local androgen levels so that the testicular development is supported, and it also produces lower levels of estradiol. By 8th week of gestational age, see, if this is the testicular sex cord, these are the blue cells are the Sertoli cells, yellow cells are the primordial germ cells. This structure is surrounded by connective tissue or the mesenchyme. From these mesenchymal tissue, the Leydig cells develop, and the Leydig cells are the source of testosterone in male. The Leydig cells increase in number till 15 to 18 weeks of gestation. After that, the number keeps on reducing, and at birth there is a constant number in males. So because the Leydig cell is the source of testosterone and it peaks at around 15 to 18 weeks of gestation, the peak testosterone concentration is also around 15 to 18 weeks of gestational age. Now, in case the gonad is developing into the ovary, what was the signal? The absence of SRY. When the SRY gene is absent, it does not cause increase in the SOX gene transcription or expression. When this gene is not transcribed, it does not repress the proteins that stimulate ovarian development, and it causes the somatic cells of the gonads to form follicles. We discussed this in the previous slides. Now, what are the proteins which stimulate ovarian development? Just have a look at it. Do not have to remember this. WNT4, RSPO1, DAX1 and FOX1. So at 6th week, the gonad receives a signal by the absence of SRI that it will form the ovary. Now, because the SRI is not present and the somatic cells become follicles and not Sertoli cells, so the female will have no AMH. Since there is no AMH, as I already told, the Mullerian duct will grow rather than regressing. So this Mullerian duct grows and forms the uterus, the fallopian tube and the upper part of the vagina. See, the Wolffian duct produces the epididymis, the vas deferens and the seminal vesicle in male. Again, since there is no Leydig cell in female, there is no testosterone. The absence of this testosterone hormone causes Wolffian duct regression. And because testosterone is present in males because of Leydig cells, there is Wolffian duct development. One important thing that we have to remember here is that the male structures that I discussed, the epididymis, vas deferens, seminal vesicles which develop from the Wolffian duct are testosterone dependent. But the female structures, the uterus, fallopian tube, upper part of the vagina, which develop from the Mullerian duct are not estrogen dependent. They are only formed because of no AMH presence. Okay, so this is a major difference between the structural differences of male and female. So again, we'll summarize. By 6th week, the gonad receives the signal that it will form the ovary. By 9th week, the primordial germ cell will produce oogonia. This oogonia undergoes a process of rapid mitosis, and by 16 to 20 weeks, the female has around 6 to 7 million oogonia, which is the highest number of oogonia that the female will have at any point of life. This is the highest number. After that, the oogonia persistently undergoes atresia and decrease in number. By the 11 to 13 weeks of gestation, the first meiotic division happens. What signals the first meiotic division? The rete ovary. Now, what is rete ovary? Ovary has 3 parts: outer cortex, inner medulla and the hilum, which has the blood vessel, nerves, connective tissue and hilar cells. This is altogether known as the rete ovary. So rete ovary produces certain proteins that signal the first meiotic division, and the mesonephros that is present behind the gonadal ridge also produces a meiosis inducing factor. So the oogonia enters the first meiotic division. What are the stages of stage 1 of meiosis? Prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1 and telophase 1. Again, the prophase can be divided into leptotin, zygotin, pachytin, diplotin and dikinesis. The progression meiosis of the oogonia to the primary oocyte to the diplotin stage occurs throughout pregnancy. The whole process, which starts at around 11 to 13 weeks, continues till the end of pregnancy and is arrested at the diplotin stage of the pro-1 process. So again, summarizing the stages of oogonial development, the primordial germ cell will form oogonia around 9th week. By mitosis, around 6 to 7 million oogonia will be formed by 16 to 20 weeks. Most of them will undergo atresia because of various reasons. At birth, the female fetus will have 1 to 2 million oogonia. And at puberty, again because of atresia, only 3 to 5 lakhs will be left, of which only 400 will ovulate throughout the lifetime. So the stages of oogonesis, if we see, the first stage, as I already told, is the oogonia, which is the diploid cell. Before birth, until the end of pregnancy, it will undergo mitosis and it will undergo the first meiotic division. In the second trimester, the first meiotic division will start, proceeding through prophase 1, leptotin, zygotin, pectin, diplotin, and at this phase, at this stage, the primary oocyte will be arrested. Development will be arrested at this stage. So at birth, all the oocytes that are present in a female baby are in the primary oocyte stage. Okay. Now, what will happen when the female reaches puberty, when the girl reaches puberty? The hypothalamus is again activated. It produces GnRH, which acts on pituitary to produce gonadotrophin, and FHS levels increase in the females, and this causes the meiosis that is arrested at the diplotin stage of prophase 1 to be resumed again. So at each ovulatory cycle, the primary oocyte will undergo the first meiotic division and it will form the secondary oocyte and the first polar body will be released. This is a haploid state. The secondary oocyte is the stage of oocyte that is actually released during ovulation and which is practically in clinical practice known as the ovum, that is released during ovulation. This secondary oocyte again is arrested in the second meiotic division unless and until a spermatogonia happens to fertilize the secondary oocyte. The process of fertilization causes resumption of the second meiotic division and forms the product of conception, and the second polar body is released. So this is how the oogogenesis happens. This is an important question that you can be asked in NEET. Spermatogenesis in males, it starts at puberty. Okay, the stage of oogonial development is now complete. So what was the fourth stage of gonadal development? The stage of follicle formation. By 18 to 20 weeks of gestational age, the primordial follicle will develop. Now what is the primordial follicle? It is a primary oocyte which is arrested in meiosis 1, enveloped in a single layer of granulosa cell and basal lamina. This is the primordial follicle. So the stages of follicle formation are, which has already been covered in other classes: primordial follicle. The next stage is primary follicle. The main difference between primordial and primary is that the flat cells of the granulosa will become cuboidal and the zona pellucida will develop around the primary oocyte, and at this stage the primary follicle starts developing FSH receptors. Then the primary follicle becomes the secondary follicle. In the secondary follicle, instead of one layer of granulosa cells, there are two layers of granulosa cells, and surrounding the granulosa cells outside the basal lamina, theca cells are produced, which are again in two layers, theca interna, theca externa. Up to the secondary follicle, the growth is independent of gonadotrophin. So this phase is also known as the preantral follicle phase. The secondary oocytes, when they start developing fluid-filled spaces called antrum, they are now known as the antral follicle or the Graafian follicle. The granulosa cells in this stage of the follicle are multiple, around more than 9 layers. The granulosa cells which immediately surround the oocyte are known as the corona radiata. Now, after the antral follicle state, we have the pre-ovulatory or the dominant follicle state, which later ovulates. In this case, after development of corona radiata, the granulosa cells that surround the oocyte will become multiple layered, and this is known as cumulus oophorus. This dominant follicle later undergoes ovulation. At 6th month of gestational age, around 5 to 7 primordial follicles are present. We've already discussed that. So the important points which can be potential need questions are: the secondary oocyte is the ovum that is released in ovulation. I already discussed that. The corona radiata is the innermost layer of the cumulus oophorus. In each menstrual cycle, a cohort of 5 to 7 pre-ovulatory follicle compete to form the dominant follicle. Time required for a resting follicle to ovulate is 365 days, equivalent to 13 menstrual cycles, and the time required for a preantral follicle to ovulate is 90 days. So these are things that you have to remember. At birth, the ovary only has primordial follicle which has the primary oocyte. Okay? By infancy, at about 6 months of age, the follicles will reach the antral stage by developing fluid-filled structures. The reason for this will be increased FSH and increased LH. Now, in childhood, there is the maximal suppression of hypothalamic function, and the pituitary has a very low response. So, the follicular development stays to the antral stage only and does not go to the pre-ovulatory and dominant follicular state. But the oocyte atresia and oocyte growth still occurs, and the ovary is not silent in childhood. The only thing is that the follicular stage does not progress beyond the antral stage. During puberty, the hypothalamus becomes mature. It produces GnRH. This GnRH happens to act on the GnRH receptors on the pituitary, which then produces FSH. This FSH acts on granulosa cells, and this causes the meiosis 1 that was arrested in diplotin to restart. And this causes the release of secondary oocyte in each cycle. The rest of the things we have already discussed during oogenesis. So, we have covered the basics of the development of the gonads and reproductive system. Now we shall be discussing neuroendocrinology of reproduction. Neuro because it has neuronal connection and nervous system has a function in it, and endocrine because of the hormones involved. So basically, the menstrual cycle and the reproduction after that is regulated by the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. The components are the hypothalamus, which is the main controller of the orchestra, which acts on the anterior pituitary via receptors, and the anterior pituitary then produces gonadotrophins which act on the ovary. So this axis matures at puberty. Now coming to the first important endocrine organ related to reproduction, the hypothalamus. As the name suggests, the hypothalamus is located below the thalamus, above the brainstem, and forms the floor of the third ventricle. The components of the hypothalamus are optic chiasm, tuber cinereum, infundibular stalk, mammillary bodies, and posterior perforated substance. The hypothalamus has two parts: posteromedial, which has a sympathetic innervation, and anterolateral, which has a parasympathetic innervation. Within the hypothalamus are peptidergic, peptide forming, neurohormone secreting neural cells. These cells have characteristics both of neuron and endocrine cells. So the hormones that they produce are known as neurohormones. Now the hypothalamic neurohormones are named according to the respective target cell population on which it acts in the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamic signal that controls the function of the anterior pituitary gonadotrophic cells, FSH and LH producing cells, is called the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, GnRH. The neurohormones that control the function of pituitary adenocorticotropic hormones and thyrotropic hormones are called corticotrophin releasing hormone and thyrotropin releasing hormone respectively. Now, the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary via a hypothalamic hypophysioportal system. The nerve endings and the blood vessels together form a complex portal system which carries the signals and the hormones from hypothalamus to the pituitary. So what are the major hypothalamic hormones? So the hypothalamus basically is a complex of number of nuclei. The paraventricular nuclei produces corticotrophin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Arcuate nucleus produces dopamine and GnRH. Preoptic nucleus produces GRH. Periventricular nucleus produces somatostatin, and supraventricular and paraventricular nuclei produce ADH and oxytocin. So this is the structure of hypothalamus and pituitary. You can see there are various nucleus. This is the preoptic area. This is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is the optic chiasm, and this is the main nucleus which is responsible for the GnRH production, because there is the GnRH producing peptidodergic endocrine neural cells which produce GnRH are located in the arcuate nucleus. Now, as you can see, the axonal process of this nucleus ends near the portal system. So this tract that you are seeing in the red colored tract is the tuberoinfundibular tract, GnRH tuberoinfundibular tract. The GnRH secretion that happens occurs in pulsatile function. It is not continuous and it is not produced in the same concentration throughout the menstrual cycle. It happens in different frequencies and amplitude. And the reason why the GnRH secretion is pulsatile is because it is controlled by two systems. One is the dopaminergic neuron system, which actually has a negative regulatory role on the GnRH production, and the norepinephrine serotonin system, which has a positive stimulatory role on the GnRH neurons. These two mechanisms cause a pulsatile release of GnRH hormone. Coming to the first major hormone and the hormone that is most important for reproduction, that is GnRH. The GnRH is a decapeptide, contains 10 amino acid. The gene that is responsible for GnRH hormone production lies on chromosome 8. The GnRH producing neuroendocrine cells, they first originate in the olfactory area embryologically. Then they migrate along the cranial nerves connecting the nose to the forebrain by nervus terminalis. Around 1000 to 3000 GnRH producing cells then are present in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, and their axons reach the medial eminence and the portal system. Why this embryology is important is, suppose the migration does not happen, then a pathology called Kallmann syndrome develops. It is a genetic disease which is usually X-linked recessive, and that is why 7 times more common in males. Because of lack of migration of this GnRH producing cells from the olfactory region to the forebrain, in Kallmann syndrome there is absent GnRH, and because the olfactory system is also involved, the patients will have absent sense of smell, anosmia, or reduced sense of smell. Clinical features of these patients will be delayed or absent puberty because of absent GnRH, infertility of course, ill-defined secondary sexual characteristics, and later in life, because FSH/LH is not produced, estrogen is not produced, the calcium homeostasis does not properly happen, so patients will have osteoporosis. The treatment is gonadotrophin therapy, hormone therapy, testosterone in male, and estrogen and progesterone in females. Now, I'll tell you a very interesting thing. See, as I already told you that the olfactory epithelial cells and the GnRH neurons embryologically are present at the same position. And like the olfactory epithelial cells in the nasal cavity, the GnRH neurons also have cilia. Now, because of common origin and structural similarity, they produce a phenomenon called pheromone. They produce an evolution from reproduction controlled by pheromones. Now, what are pheromones? Pheromones are airborne chemicals released by one individual that can affect other membranes of the same species. So, some odorless compounds in the axilla of women in the late follicular phase of the menstrual cycle will accelerate the LH surge in the recipient woman via the olfactory system. So, it is usually seen that in women who work together much of the time, they exhibit asynchrony in the menstrual cycle timing. Now, this mechanism is still being questioned, but this is a very interesting phenomenon, how pheromones act, and this is because embryologically the olfactory epithelial cells and they have a structural similarity to GnRH neurons. So, as I already told you, the GnRH release is pulsatile and the pulse frequency is high during follicular phase, slow during the late luteal phase. The activity is low in childhood. Insulin will increase GnRH activity and prolactin will decrease the GnRH activity. The T half of the natural gonadotrophin releasing hormone is very less. It is around 2 to 4 minutes. This we have already discussed. The pulsatile release is because of norepinephrine serotonin tract and the dopaminergic tuberoinfundibular tract. The dopamine tract has a negative effect on the GnRH release. Norepinephrine has a positive effect on the GnRH release. Both of them acting on the arcuate nucleus which contains the GnRH neurons. Both of them control the GnRH pulse. Then they act on the anterior pituitary, causing production of FSH, LH and release of prolactin. This completes natural GnRH. In clinical practice, we use certain drugs which are synthetic GnRH analogs. Now, as I already told you that the natural GnRH has a very short t-half of 2 to 4 minutes. Why? This is because of the rapid cleavage of bonds between the amino acid 5, 6, 6, 7, 9, 10. By substituting these amino acids, we can increase the t-half and increase the time of action, and we can change the therapeutic properties, and we can use them in various pathological conditions. So the GnRH analogs can be divided into two categories: GnRH agonists and GnRH antagonists. The first category of drug is GnRH agonist. So how is a GnRH agonist produced? It is produced by the substitution of amino acid at the 6th position of the GnRH decapeptide chain. I already told you it is a decapeptide. If we substitute the amino acid at the 6th position, we produce GnRH, synthetic GnRH agonists. The route of administration of these drugs can be intramuscular, intravascular or subcutaneous, and I am missing intranasal. Okay. The mechanism of action of GnRH agonist is very important. Initially, when you give it, it will bind to the GnRH receptors on the anterior pituitary, and first it will have a positive flare response. It will increase the FSH and LH. But when you continually give it for a span of 1 to 3 weeks, first it will lead to desensitization of GnRH receptor, and then it will lead to loss of GnRH receptors. This will cause decreased FSH and decreased LH, ultimately leading to a decreased estradiol level. So the mechanism of GnRH agonist is to produce a hypogonadotrophic hypogonadal state. Because of the hypogonadal state, lowering of estrogen state, GnRH agonists are used clinically in conditions which are estrogen dependent disorders. What are the estrogen dependent disorders? Endometriosis, uterine leiomyoma or fibroid, precocious puberty, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Now, what is endometriosis, what is leiomyoma, what is precocious puberty, what is PMDD shall all be subsequently described and covered in classes later on. But at this point of time, we should remember that all of these are estrogen dependent disorders. Whenever there is a high estrogen level, these pathologies they develop. So when we are giving GnRH agonist by producing hypogonadotrophic hypogonadal levels, it lowers the estrogen and helps in this estrogen dependent states and cures these problems. So there is a very good mnemonic which helps us remember the various clinical uses of GnRH agonists: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, P. A for adenomyosis, which is also an estrogen dependent condition. B for irritable bowel syndrome. C for CA breast. D dysfunctional uterine bleeding. E for endometriosis. F for fibroid. H for hirsutism. I for infertility, and P for precocious puberty. In males, GnRH agonists are used in condition called cryptorchidism. In this case, we use intranasal nafarelin. It's also used in CA prostate, BPH, that is benign prostatic hypertrophy, where nafarelin and leuprolidine are both used. Now, what are the various GnRH agonists that we use? buserelin, nafarelin. These are the two drugs which can be used by the nasal route. The other GnRH agonists are goserelin, leuprolelin, triptorelin, and historelin. Now, as important the clinical conditions where we can use GnRH agonist, it is very important to remember that we cannot give this treatment for more than 6 months. It's not recommended because long-term use of GnRH agonist causes menopausal symptoms like vaginal dryness, hot flushes, irregular menses, spotting, and because estrogen helps in calcium homeostasis, it also increases the chances of osteoporosis. So whenever we are prescribing GnRH agonist, it's very important that we prescribe calcium to these patients. Okay. Now coming to the second group of drugs, GnRH antagonists. Now the GnRH antagonists are synthesized by multiple amino acid substitutions at position 2 and 3 of the decapeptide GnRH natural state. The various drugs that are GnRH antagonists are cetrorelix, atarelix, ganirelix, and nalglu. The route of administration again is IM, sub-Q, and oral. Recently an oral preparation has been invented. The mechanism of action of GnRH antagonist is it binds to the GnRH receptors of anterior pituitary and it competitively inhibits the natural GnRH. This leads to an immediate decline in gonadotrophin release, that is, it decreases FSH and LH, hypogonadotrophic, and hence decreases estrogen formation, hypogonadal state. So, GnRH agonist and antagonist, ultimately both of them will have the same clinical effect. They will produce hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism. The GnRH agonists will take longer time to produce this effect, but the GnRH antagonists produces this effect immediately within 24 to 72 hours. Similarly, this GnRH antagonists are all used in estrogen dependent disorders, endometriosis, precocious puberty, infertility. In males, it is used in CA prostate. One use of GnRH antagonist is in male contraception. The nalglu, when given for 3 weeks, inhibits spermatogenesis and helps in contraception in males. Apart from GnRH, another important hormone that the hypothalamus produces is dopamine. The dopamine is also known as prolactin inhibitory hormone. The source of dopamine, as we already discussed, is the arcuate nucleus. The function of dopamine is to regulate the GnRH pulsatile release by having a negative effect on the arcuate nucleus. It, as the name suggests, inhibits prolactin. Dopamine also acts on the chemoreceptor trigger zone and causes vomiting. So this decreased prolactin and the action on chemoreceptor trigger zone will explain the various drugs that dopamine agonists and dopamine antagonists and the mechanism of action of these drugs. See, because it inhibits prolactin, if we have a condition where there is hyperprolactinemia, then we should give a drug that will increase the dopamine level, which is the dopamine agonist. What are the dopamine agonists? Bromocriptine and cabergoline. So the uses of dopamine agonists are conditions like hyperprolactinemia. These drugs are also used when a female wants to stop lactation. See, lactation will happen because of high prolactin levels. So if you give a drug that inhibits the prolactin, which is a dopamine agonist, it will stop lactation. Usually the drug that we give is cabergoline. Now, as I already told you, it acts on the chemoreceptor trigger zone to cause vomiting. So if we give a dopamine antagonist, it will reduce the vomiting. So very commonly used dopamine antagonist that is given clinically for reducing vomiting is Perinom or metoclopramide. Perinom, because it is a dopamine antagonist, it will have an opposite action of dopamine. So instead of decreasing prolactin, it will increase prolactin. So this drug Perinom is also given to increase prolactin level in females who want to increase their milk secretion or want to increase lactation. This completes the hypothalamus. The next organ, endocrine organ that is important in reproduction is pituitary. It produces the two major gonadotrophins, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These two hormones then act on ovary, and the ovary produces a plethora of hormones, around 11 hormones, the most important of them being estrogen and progesterone. The estrogen is the main hormone of the first part of the menstrual cycle, which is the follicular phase. The estrogen helps in increasing the endometrial thickness, and endometrial causes the endometrial formation of the stratum basilis layer of the endometrium, which is the functional layer which is shed during menstrual cycle. This formation happens in the uterus in the first phase of the menstrual cycle or the proliferative phase of the endometrial cycle, also known as the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. During the first 14 days, the primary oocyte will become secondary oocyte and will be released during ovulation. This is what is happening in the ovary. In the same time span, the estrogen that is formed by the developing follicles will act on the endometrium and cause proliferation of the uterine endometrium, and the endometrial thickness will increase, and it will help in increasing the receptivity of the endometrium to the product of conception if it is produced later. So the first 14 days finishes like this. In the second half of the menstrual cycle, which is known as the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle or the secretory phase of the endometrial cycle. In this phase, ovulation has happened, corpus luteum will form, which will have its maximum function at day 8 of ovulation, that is around 22nd day of the menstrual cycle. Now the secondary oocyte that is released at ovulation enters into the fallopian tube and reaches the ampulla. Suppose the sperm or the spermatogonia is present in the ampulla of the fallopian tube at that time, then the secondary oocyte will undergo fertilization and the zygote will form. This zygote then again undergoes a plethora of multiplication and various stages of development, and it enters into the uterine cavity around the 4th to 5th day of formation of the zygote, and it implants in the blastocyst stage. Now this everything will be discussed in detail during reproduction. So this was the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. During this span, from the 14th to 28th day, the uterus undergoes certain changes, and this part of the cycle is known as the secretory phase. In this part of the cycle, the endometrial layer that had proliferated in the first 14 days will develop glands, will develop blood vessels, and it will become very soft. So it can be basically divided into a basal layer, a spongy layer, and a compact layer, and it prepares for the implantation of the product of conception if it forms. In case the product of conception is not formed, the fertilization does not happen, then there is shedding of the stratum basilis layer of the, which is the functional layer of the endometrium, which sheds during the end of the menstrual cycle. And then again the menstrual cycle starts from day 0. See, all this will be taught in detail. Actually, it has been taught to you. Menstrual cycle class has already been taken previously, so we are not going to study the details of the menstrual cycle. In the next class, I shall be covering the pituitary hormones FSH, LH, the ovary in detail, the ovarian hormones, and some accessory endocrine organs like the thyroid, the pineal gland, the carotid sheath, which also have a role in the elaborate orchestra that leads to the menstrual cycle. So in the next class, before we go into discussing the endocrinology part of reproduction, we'll have a small test, and I'll be giving you a questionnaire, and I'll be asking you a few questions, and after that we will be resuming the topic. So if there is any doubt regarding what we covered today, you can post your questions now, and I shall be answering it. Okay, thank you so much.